Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking. Today we're continuing on in Genesis chapter 31, the second half of it, talking about Laban pursuing Jacob. Last week we saw that Jacob got his wives ready and all his household, and he was going to leave because God had called him back to his family, back to his homeland. So he was going to have to face his fears and confront the things he had left behind in his past. And so he was preparing to do that, and his wives gave him good advice that he needed to do what God had told him, do whatever God tells you. And then immediately after that we saw that Rachel made a poor choice. After giving great advice, she made a poor, sinful choice of her own and stole her father's household gods. So we're going to see what that means in this passage. So I'm going to read it, and then we'll get right into today's discussion. Starting in verse 22. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. Then God came to Laban, the Aramean, in a dream at night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him, and Laban and his relatives camped there too. Then Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You've deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you, but last night the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.' Now you have gone off because you longed to return to your father's household. But why did you steal my gods?" Jacob answered Laban, "I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. But if you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything of yours here with me, and if so, take it." Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. So Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the 2 female servants, but he found nothing. After he came out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent, but found nothing. Rachel said to her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." So he searched, but could not find the household gods. Jacob was angry and took Laban to task. "What is my crime?" he asked Laban. "How have I wronged you that you hunt me down? Now that you have searched through all my goods, what have you found that belongs to your household? Put it here in front of your relatives and mine, and let them judge between the two of us. I have been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself, and you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for the 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you." Laban answered Jacob, "The women are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine, yet what can I do today about these daughters of mine, or about the children they have borne? Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us." So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. He said to his relatives, "Gather some stones." So they took stones and piled them in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jegar Sadahatha, and Jacob called it Gilead. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me today." That is why it was called Gilead. It was also called Mizpah, because he said, "May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take any wives besides my daughters, even though no one is with us, remember that God is a witness between you and me." Laban also said to Jacob, "Here is this heap, and here is this pillar I've set up between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and that you will not go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us." So Jacob took an oath in the name of the fear of his father Isaac. He offered a sacrifice there in the hill country and invited his relatives to a meal. After they had eaten, they spent the night there. Early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. So a lot has happened in this story, and a lot is changing from the previous stories, we see that we are propelling forward. We're going to get closer to Jacob going home. But before we get to that, we have this confrontation with Laban. Laban was deceived by Jacob because Jacob did not reveal that he was going to leave. He had deceived him once again, his repetitive trait, and the trait that Laban had as well. So it kind of paid him back in that way. But this deception caused a very difficult, at first at least, confrontation between the two men. And it would have probably gone way worse if God had not intervened. Before Laban could speak to Jacob, when he had overtaken him and caught up to him, God appeared to him in a vision and warned him not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. So with this warning, God himself divinely intervened in this story, making sure that Jacob would be able to return home where God had called him. Thus, God is being faithful to fulfill his promise to Jacob, to take care of him and to lead him, and that he is going to return home safely. So we see that God is always faithful, and we can know that for ourselves in our own lives. When God has called us to something, we know that he is faithful and that he will bring that to completion. So we don't have to live in fear of those who are trying to oppose us or any of the other circumstances and situations we find ourselves in. We just need to seek after God as he continues to lead us forward. So that's what Jacob is doing here in this story. But Laban confronts him anyways. Even though God tells him, don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad, he still goes to him and talks and says things to him. So it seems that he didn't quite get all of God's warning. He got part of it. He didn't probably take his tough talk to the extremes that he may have if God had not warned him. But he still does say some things that seem to be bad towards Jacob, because he accuses him of leading him and of leaving him and taking his daughters and all of his family as captives or spoil. And then he also says that he did a very foolish thing. So it seems that he did not fully grasp what God had told him not to do. Nevertheless, it did not go into a full-blown confrontation. Jacob handled it respectfully while also being defensive. And he explained to him why he left the way he did, and he explains the difference between him and Laban, how Laban had constantly taken advantage of him and deceived him and changed his wages and made him work and kept changing the deal because Laban had wanted to rip him off and get the benefits himself. He saw that God was blessing him, and he continually tried to take the blessing himself. But God, as Jacob is very good and able to point out in this story, God blessed him anyways, and no matter what Laban tried to do, God was able to work out his plan. It's amazing how the God of the universe is able to overcome human obstacles. We as humans like to think that we have so much power and so much control and can do so much, and yet we are nothing in the sight of God. And so even though Laban had tried to rip off his own relative Jacob, he wasn't successful because God was watching over Jacob. And so Jacob reminds him of that in this story. So we see that confrontation here. We also see that Laban he's hunting after his household gods. Why he had those, we don't have an explanation in this story, why he had chosen that. He knew that God himself had blessed Jacob. He knew that there was a God, and yet he had his own idols. And that should be something that warns us as Christians, and even those of us who are not Christians. It should warn us that we need to be careful and serve the one true God, not false idols, and certainly not mix the two. We constantly, even as Christians, want to put God up on a pedestal. We'll serve and worship God, but then we want to lower that pedestal and then put up idols, or raise up idols to be equal with God. And we do it in many things. We make all kinds of things idols, whether it be work or friends or family or sports or any kind of things, money, all kinds of different things we put up above God or equal with God, and that becomes a serious problem. And this story warns us against that, and it just points out the craziness of that. This was a guy who recognized that there was a God, that Jacob's God was the real deal. But he had his own fake idols, his own fake gods. And why he was doing this, it's not really apparent here, but he simply didn't get it. He didn't quite understand that he needed to serve one God, just as Jacob was serving the one true God. And it seems that Rachel didn't quite get this either, because she had taken those household gods, those idols, for herself and brought them along on this journey. Why? Once again, we don't get a great explanation of that. But for whatever reason she did that, we see that it creates a problem. Her father comes and tries and looks into all the tents, and at the last tent he goes into is Rachel's. And Rachel decides to join the family trait of being deceptive. She doesn't come forth honestly and say, "Yep, I did it. Here they are. This was a silly thing to do." No, instead, she lied and decided, "Oh, I'm having my period. Please go away. I can't get up. I'm definitely not sitting on the idols." That's a very silly thing that she did in this passage. But at the same time, we do the same thing. When we're confronted with something, many times we will try to deceive people. "I didn't really do that. I'm not doing this. There's nothing to see here." We hide things and we deceive people constantly. Even as Christians, we're guilty of doing that. And so this story warns us against that. And it shows just the craziness and how silly it is to do things like what Rachel did here. So then we see that there's this other confrontation between Laban and Jacob where they're still arguing over these household gods. But finally, they're able to come to a decision that they should enter into a covenant, if you will, with each other, a treaty, a peace deal, that they're not going to harm each other, and that Jacob is going to just have his 2 wives, the sisters, and he's not going to take any other wives for himself, and he's not going to treat them poorly, and he's not going to come back and try to take things from Laban, and Laban's not going to come and invade his territory. We see that there is a separation that needs to happen, kind of like with Abraham and Lot that we saw earlier on in Genesis. We're having another separation here. So it needs to happen, but at the same time, they're able to finally come to peace. And it's crazy to think that they come to this peace deal after such a hostile confrontation earlier in this chapter. And even in the previous verses, just before they make this treaty, they seem to understand they need to put their differences aside to come to peace. And that is something that is important for us as Christians. We should be able to put aside our differences with other Christians or with those around us who are not Christians. Put aside the differences, the hatred that we may feel, the distrust we may feel towards other people. We need to put those aside and be able to come to peace and to unity. And that's what these guys seemingly were able to come to, a peace deal. Setting aside their differences, they may have still had those differences, but they were able to set those aside so that they could come to peace and so that they could move forward in their respective lives, so that Laban could go back to his lifestyle and Jacob could move forward to what God was calling him to do, and that was return to his homeland. So there's a lot of things in this chapter, but we see the hand of God at work throughout the whole chapter, how he is continually calling Jacob to come home and getting rid of the obstacles and all the things that are coming against Jacob, all the things that the enemy would try to place in his way of him following what God had called him to do. So we should be able to see that in our own lives, that God is going to be able to make a way for us if we will just simply trust him and follow where he is leading us. Well, next week we'll be moving on to Genesis chapter 32, and we're going to see Jacob as he prepares to meet his brother Esau and how that's going to play out in the coming chapters. So join us next time for another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking.